Former Home Office Minister Robert Jenrick has suggested halving our aid budget in order to boost defence spending. Britain's foreign aid budget is set to rise to £8.3 billion this year. And joining me now to talk about this in more detail is Philip Ingram, former senior military intelligence officer. Philip, what do you make of Robert's proposals?
Well, on the surface of it, it sounds logical, but actually, when you drill into it, it's slightly illogical. The government is under a degree of responsibility through international treaty to pay 0.7% of our gross national income as overseas development assistance. It took a decision in 2021 to take that down to 0.5%. Mind you, we were only one of 7 countries that was hitting that target. And that money is spent in different countries, but a big chunk of it spent in the UK, looking after the refugees that have come into the UK. And we have to recognise that by setting the conditions for there not to be conflict in certain countries around the world means that the MOD is not under a remit to go out and carry out actions in those countries. And defence is merely another arm of diplomacy, but it's the one that's used whenever the rest of diplomacy fails. So let's not unfund the diplomacy that stops us having to use the MOD.
This is one of the things that I find myself fascinated by. And is there enough kind of wider strategic thinking across different government departments to make sure that we're all hitting those sort of diplomatic aims?
Well, that's a very interesting point. I think there's a couple of pieces in there. One, are we hitting the right countries with the right level of aid? Should we still be sending aid to India and Pakistan, who are both nuclear countries? India's got a space program. We have to start to get sensible and target the aid and work at this from a cross-government perspective. It used to be that all of the decisions were made by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, but we've seen in recent years an increasing proportion up to sort of 25-30% of the budget coming from other government departments as they start to take actions. And that is recognising the contributions that other government departments make into overseas development assistance. But there's a lot more that needs to be done to it. But it's not a simple method of take some money from the overseas aid budget and stick that into the Ministry of Defence, and that's going to fix the Ministry of Defence. The MOD needs to learn how to spend the money that it's got at the moment properly.
Well, that was a question I was going to ask you, because it's all very well setting an arbitrary target for spending as a percentage of GDP, but is the current budget being spent in the right ways?
No, not at all. If you look at compare us to Poland. From an MOD perspective. Now, we've got an additional cost of our strategic nuclear capability, but that isn't so significant as to bring us down to the levels of the Polish defence budget. If we look at the Polish army is it's buying a lot of new tanks and new artillery pieces, recognising the land threat that there is from Russia. It's buying about 1,000, just over 1,000 tanks and almost 1,000 artillery pieces. We're converting 143 or 148, I can't remember exactly, of our Challenger 2 tanks to Challenger 3. That's it. We don't have a program to replace our infantry fighting vehicles. Our armoured reconnaissance vehicles that are coming in have been subject to delay after delay after delay. That's the Ajax program. And we've got a 42-ton vehicle replacing what was something that was between 10 and 15 tons. That's not good for reconnaissance. The whole procurement process inside the Ministry of Defence needs a really good shake-up. And the answer isn't throw more good money after bad. It's get that money that is being misspent, spent properly, and then add additional money so you get proper bang for your bucks.
And what are those specific things that you'd want to see more cash spent on?
Well, I think the army needs to grow. It needs to grow in size, but it can't recruit to the levels it's at the moment. It needs more heavy armoured capability, both in its formations. It needs a proper heavy armoured division, or ideally 2 divisions. It needs protected vehicles for all of its troops to move around in. We're seeing the artillery decimating troops in Ukraine. It needs to bring in new technologies, such as we're seeing with the UAV, the drone technologies that are going on. We also need to have an increased Air Force capability, able to support what is going on in modern warfare capability. And we need to be able to protect our strategic naval capability. We need to have more capital ships to protect our carrier battle groups that we send around the world to be able to power project. We are a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. We are in the top 10 economies in the world. We are, whether we like it or not, part of what we'd expect to be global policemen in what's going on, given our history and given our the requirement to trade on a global basis. And we have to enable our military capability to do that. And then we need to have the stores and the logistics and the stocks of ammunition to be able to sustain operations in a modern environment, instead of pretending that they're there and, in good military parlance, having a chit in lieu of artillery shells. That doesn't work if you have to go to war.
So just a relatively short shopping list there, really. Can we quickly talk about Trident? Because Robert Jenrick is claiming that the current Trident deterrent has been, in his words, appallingly neglected. Would you share his analysis?
I wouldn't say it's been appallingly neglected. It's it's being run on, and the sailors that are manning the Trident nuclear submarines are being put under an enormous amount of pressure. It's time that we get the strategic nuclear deterrent replaced as quickly as is possible. Neglected is, I think, too strong a word. We've managed to keep a strategic nuclear deterrent boat at sea 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, permanently since we first got it. That is helping keep us safe, and is the one thing that is stopping Vladimir Putin. Our capability, along with the American capability and the French capability, that isn't quite the same, but that is what's keeping Vladimir Putin from attacking into NATO.
Well, thank you, Philip Ingram there, joining us to talk on this story about Robert Jenrick calling for increased defence spending funded by foreign aid cuts. I mean, what did you make of what Philip had to say there? It sheds quite a terrible light on the state of the current armed forces, doesn't it?
Well, if he's right in what he's saying, and I suspect he is largely, that's a pretty damning indictment of the MOD, of the Ministry of Defence. It's highly, highly unlikely, never say never, that we will be fighting a war, a conventional war on our own shores in Britain. Let's hope and pray. But it's not impossible that we might come up against Russia on the fringes of Eastern Europe if they were to set foot in Estonia, for example. So clearly, at a volatile time internationally, with Putin still in the Kremlin, we need to have a robust deterrent. And if the worst comes to worst, we need to be able to fight that war. As far as whether we should be taking money from the foreign aid budget, it's a really tricky one, because that's almost always the first budget to be attacked. As he was saying there himself, Philip Ingram, that's already been reduced from David Cameron's 0.7% to 0.5% about 3 years ago. Clearly, it needs to be targeted properly, and the risk with setting a fixed amount or a fixed percentage is that you could get civil servants scrambling to make sure that they're actually spending it. And that is probably a real risk. But if you look at India and Pakistan, and Philip was suggesting we shouldn't be giving aid to them, given that they are nuclear powers. If you are driven in a taxi from Mumbai airport into Mumbai, the levels of poverty, and I've been to about 84 countries in the world, are like nothing I've seen anywhere else. So the fact that it is a nuclear power, the fact that it is a big and growing economy, and that there are also a lot of wealthy people in India, doesn't mean that there isn't extreme poverty. The question, I suppose, is, if we stopped giving aid to India, would the Indian government step in? I'm not sure what the answer to that is. And it's also, by the way, and this is very important, about influence. It is about self-interest, not just altruism. By giving aid to other parts of the world, we buy ourselves leverage and influence. And that is part, in a way, of our defence.
Hence Philip's point there about diplomacy. But, we talk about India, which, I think is the oft-used example, given it has a space programme. Isn't there an element there of its own government should be prioritising its spending better?
Well, yes, it should. And I think you're right. If we stopped putting money into India, for example, would their government take up the reins on that one? I agree with you. I actually don't think they would. But you sort of have to look at how much of it is our problem to fix. And there are other countries where UK aid is much more targeted, is much better used, and has much better results. So I think that Robert Jenrick is right to want to have a look at international aid budget, and I think everybody does, and it is the go-to budget for people that want to cut it. But I do think that we need to look at where it goes to specifically to get the best kind of results. And we do need it for political leverage, but there is also the humanitarian side of it that we need. all of the work that goes on with women and girls and violence against women and girls, especially across the Middle East and into Africa, I think is vitally important. We would not be doing our bit in the world if we took that money away. But I think there is an argument to look at China, to look at Pakistan, to look at India and see quite what they're doing with it, and is it really value for money?
Well, you mentioned China, that this is something I'm always very intrigued by, because it feels like every so often there will be a spike, such as the hacking incident very recently around sort of Whitehall and Westminster, where foreign threats come back onto people's radars. But do you think as politicians, Parliament is too insular and perhaps isn't strategic enough at looking into those foreign threats and kind of legislating or using diplomacy to really try and tackle them?
I think there's a real problem is that when you take China and the hacking incident, is that the information about the risk of a foreign actor from China is highly classified. So that information then isn't disseminated out into departments. So if you're looking at giving a contract to a Chinese firm, for example, to look at infrastructure, you don't have all of the intelligence information that has been gathered because you don't have the right clearance level. So I think there is a bit of a disconnect here. There is a lot of information out there, a lot of which we're not allowed to have, don't have the right clearance, can't make those decisions. So I think that we need to look at what we do with that intelligence going forward.